these are some of the types of reports that people are doing in 12 months in terms of their ability to automate them. And you'll see it's not all public information. Many of these are things that just stay inside the company. But they're also things that have been prepared manually to this point in time. So let's talk about which of those two documents that the analysts actually use. So where do analysts obtain company disclosures? What do you think? What's the right answer here? F. Okay? So I moderated a panel on Wall Street about a month ago at SIFMA, which is the Industry Association for the Sell Side, Buy Side. And I had panelists from Goldman, from JP Morgan Chase, from Morgan Stanley, and from Brown Brothers Harriman. And I asked them this question: where do you guys get the data for your analytics? And they were, do you use the company financial statements? Nope, don't use them. You're kidding me. Nope, don't use them. Where do you guys get the data? We buy it from third parties, data aggregators. Why do you do that? Because we can automate the process. You know, if you think we're going to have a bunch of analysts sitting around manually rekeying data, that's, you know, that we did that 30 years ago. Okay? So they get it from third parties. They buy it from third parties that are unrelated to the companies. People like Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, OneSource, those people are parsing your traditional reports and they're putting it into their own taxonomies, they're structuring it, and then they sell that data back to the analyst. At Brown Brothers Harriman, they have 100 people in New York that check that data. That's all they do. 100 people that check that data. Because it's wrong. It's wrong. And it's very wrong, and it's also very limited. If you go out and look on the internet, you'll find that there's about a 25 to 30% error rate just on the primary tables. And I know we're not in Missouri, but I'm going to show you in just a second 3 companies who may be in this audience. I'm going to show you examples of their reports right now this morning on how bad this actually is. But the issue here is that the unstructured reports are being distorted by third-party intermediaries, and that's where the analysts get the data. So if you've ever been on an analyst call where an analyst asks some question and everybody on the company conference call looks at each other and go, what the heck are they talking about? That's not what our data is. Now you know why. Because they're using somebody else's data that may not even remotely resemble your data. So the first company I'll use is the hometown guy, Goodyear. What you have here is the Goodyear income statement. And over here, you have the Google Finance data for Goodyear. And if the data has a red box around it, that's because it doesn't exist over here. And Google is buying the data from one of the third-party data aggregators. It's just publicly available. And in the case of net income, you'll see that it's actually different. Okay? So they have, what's that, 7 or 8 numbers here that are different. That's Goodyear. Here's Progressive. Every number that has a red box is not represented in the data aggregator data. Okay? Pretty big. Here's Eaton. Now, these are just 3 examples. You know, it's Thursday. I understand here on the campus Thursday night's an alcoholic beverage night. So if your company's not up here, tonight would be a good time for you to go and look at this with an adult beverage in your hand. You could actually see what's going on with your company. But I'm telling you, you'll need an adult beverage or lubrication because you're going to be shocked. And that's one of the problems in the supply chain, is the analysts may not be using your data. Now, I did get one of the guys to admit that he did actually use the company financial statements. He says, yeah, in an Enron or WorldCom situation, I'll go back and pull out the financials. But in normal operations, I won't. Now, here's some examples of analytical applications that use XBRL. Some of these are free, and others you have to pay for. But they enable you to suck all this data into models and to use. Now for the students, where you're doing your forever search, this 9W search might be very interesting to you. It's free, and it might help you very quickly analyze 3 or 4 companies. Here's the modelware program by Morgan Stanley. The SEC staff tends to use a lot of this Edgar Online metrics, but they're also developing their own with Craig Lewis and the whole data modeling there, analytics. But these are some examples, and here's a picture of our internal tool. We don't sell this, we just use it internally. But if you were to ask our people, do you use XBRL? They would say, no, we use IDP. Because it looks to them like a browser or Excel. So if you ask an analyst at Morgan Stanley, do you use XBRL? No, don't. We use modelware. That's because it looks like modelware, it looks like Excel. It's like asking your mother, hey mom, do you use HTML? No. That Google's great though, I love that, right? So it's behind the scenes. Now, this idea is so pervasive that SIFMA, the industry association, and the members of the Asset Management Forum are people like Fidelity, Goldman, State Street. They're the major firms on Wall Street. They wrote a letter to the SEC asking the SEC to expand the XBRL mandate to all company reports. Now, you're not going to hear this out of the FEI. You're not going to hear this out of most of the people who are out there talking about the cost of XBRL, but this is what the consumers say. We would like a lot more things to be in XBRL because it would lower the cost of consumption, but more importantly, it would increase the accuracy of what's being communicated. Because right now there's this tremendous level of distortion that is not good for anybody. So from an investor relations perspective, two basic ideas. One would be to start communicating in XBRL so that the analysts could get what they want in a timely, effective fashion, because when they get it wrong, that impacts your liquidity and your pricing. But another idea might be just for the cost of it. So here's a company that took their entire investor relations site and converted it into an XBRL platform. Now, the unfair part of what I just said is that this company happens to have 65,000 developers. So the cost of them doing it's no big deal. But if you go out to Microsoft today, their investor relations site is driven by XBRL. And here's why. Prior to that, they were producing documents. Controller's office, marketing, CEO's office. So there's all these silos that were producing documents and putting them on the internet. That's good, but it's also bad because eventually these silos are not collaborating like we talked about. They were producing different information that they couldn't see. So by creating that social collaborative process, the organization was able to manage that information in an institutional way. Because previously, you have information that's going like this, that the analysts start asking difficult questions on. Or this part is saying over there, and this part over here is just silent. So the institutional assessment of the information, which gets into analytics you'll hear about in a minute, that is a very powerful piece of managing your information. And that's what drove Microsoft to change the way they manage information using XBRL on their investor relations site. Now, this idea, as I mentioned, is not just occurring with the SEC. It's happening with organizations all over the world. This is a listing of them where you see an underline is where they actually have assurance on the reports. Now, let me play that out for you. What does convergence mean to you? What does it mean? Right? This is what it means. For most accountants, this is what we're talking about. Okay? Does anybody know what that word means?
Yes.
What does it mean?
It means the United States accepts under USGAP what would be acceptable having been promulgated by the IASB under IFRS.
Okay. There we go. That's a definition for the word. Thank you very much, Nick. So these are the typical things that people think about when they think about convergence. Okay? Here's what the Minister of Finance thinks about it. He really doesn't really care about accountants. He cares about process. So I want you to go back to the question I asked you earlier about the two trains. The Minister of Finance in the Netherlands, the Minister of Finance in China, the Treasurer in Australia, here's what they think. They wonder, why do you as a company have to provide an 1120 to the IRS, a 10K to the SEC, state tax returns to 50 states? All these other regulators are asking for all this information. Why is it that you have to fill out all those forms on all those different bases of accounting? So in the Netherlands, the Minister of Finance there took all those forms from all those agencies, 5,000 forms, and converged them into an IFRS-based XBRL taxonomy. 5,000 forms, 200,000 disparate data elements were converged into one taxonomy, 10,000 elements. In the Netherlands today, every legal entity can submit a single report in XBRL to the Ministry of Finance that eliminates all government reporting, federal, state, and local level. Okay? Why aren't we doing that here? Now, if you have operations in the Netherlands, it is doubtful that your controller has called you and said, hey, why don't we eliminate and streamline all this? Because the next question would be, what am I going to do for my job? Right? And I've had this conversation with many large public companies where that's exactly what's happened. And then the controller's office calls the Netherlands and the guy says, absolutely, that's the case here. And then there's a more interesting conversation that takes place after that. So be proactive on this point. So here is, in fact, the Treasurer, Ken Henry of Australia. And you see, this is the primary objective of what they call standard business reporting, is to reduce compliance burden. Okay? Now, these organizations at the government level would tell you it's about a 25% cost reduction. The chambers of commerce in these countries would tell you it's 50%. Okay? Because in the Netherlands, they went from 200,000 data elements to 10,000, from 5,000 forms down to 1,000, to one taxonomy. So there is a fairly significant compliance burden. I don't think it's as simple as 25%. But if you have, operations in any of these countries here, they're moving down the path on SBR, and you may want to look into that. So here's the one in the Netherlands. Okay. So in terms of the broader compliance considerations, I think you should think about these kinds of ideas in terms of streamlining the last mile, but also taking advantage of something like SBR. If you're a multinational, even a private company, in the UK, this is a requirement at the legal entity level. Okay? So I was talking to a private company, you could name a couple big ones, but they were under the impression that this didn't apply to them. And so I asked them, so what are you doing in the UK for your tax return? Oh, we outsource that. I said, and you have how many legal entities in the UK? They said 40. I said, so you've got 40 statutory accounts that somebody else is tagging for you in the UK, and that's what's impacting your tax calculation. And that was the case. So that's the kind of opportunity that you have if you're a private company. What I've described for you with the SEC, you've got 40 of those going on in the UK today. So that's the opportunity here in terms of scale. So if you think about today, you have manual pre-Henry Ford assembly shops in every country. What about a service center based on IFRS that begins to drop off the information to the ministers of finance in XBRL in every country? It's a different model, but it would allow you to pull significant cost and streamline those reporting processes. Now, that's still pretty early, but we are working with a number of companies that are working towards that today. They're thinking about regional service centers, which you may already have, but they're also thinking about pulling back out of those countries and leveraging this idea of disclosure management to facilitate that process. Will it happen in the US? Yesterday, the House unanimously passed the Accountability and Transparency legislation. Digital Accountability and Transparency Act was unanimously passed in the House yesterday. This would mandate the use of XBRL across all federal agencies. It goes to the Senate next week. What's driving this today here in the US is the debacles with the GSA and Secret Service and the lack of transparency with the information for basically management of what's going on. So the exact same problems that you have in your organization, the government has within their organizations in spades, and we as taxpayers are paying for that. So the people in Washington, frankly, they're looking at what's happening in China, in Japan, with SBR, and they're wondering if they lower the cost of compliance in those countries, is that a bigger incentive for people to do business there than what we offer here in the US? And that's a policy question, but those are the kind of things that are occurring. Certainly when I work with the Ministry of Finance in China, and we had a conversation actually last night on this exact topic with the folks in Beijing, that's what they're thinking about. I work with the Bermuda Monetary Authority, which is a big policy group for insurance, and this is what they're thinking. They want to be the premier commercial location for insurance companies around the world. And so this kind of concept, SBR, is very attractive to them from a policy perspective. Okay? So these ideas are things that are occurring around the world, and I'm trying to tune you into them. In terms of tactical next steps for you, here's sort of a laundry listing. The first one, if you're a public company, please use the analytical tools to interrogate your report. Take a look at the disclosure management tools that are listed, find one that best fits your needs, and lay out a program to implement them. The key point is on the process and control implementations. The key thing I've got to say to you is do not give it to Johnny or Sally and ask them to implement it. You really have to step back and look at everybody in your organization and figure out a methodical approach to encouraging all of them to use the internet, to use disclosure management. It's not just a webmaster activity. That's the number one thing that I see with companies doing implementations where they frankly get it wrong. And this is the way to make sure that as many people as possible participate. It doesn't have to be a big bang. It can be evolutionary. You can let your people figure out what's good for them. They'll act in their own best interest and benefit from that. I didn't mention this earlier, but the idea of RSS feeds, an RSS feed is simply a free broadcasting mechanism over the internet. That's what SEC uses at Edgar, and it's basically cable television. So I can sit at home on my television, and when you post a report, it's automatically broadcast to me. I don't have to come to your website because I don't know when you're going to post it. When you post it, it's broadcast to me. If it's an XBRL, it's automatically uploaded into my models and analyzed. So the distance in time between when you post and when I analyze it is something we'd measure in seconds. If your data trips one of my anomaly detectors, a doorbell on my laptop rings and I come and look at it. If it doesn't, it may give me an indication of what I should do. That whole process we'd measure in seconds, maybe 120. It's not like the old days where I'm going to be manually pulling it down, manually analyzing. It's actually done in seconds. So an RSS feed would be something to consider. And then, just like the Maryland Institute of CPAs, applying this against your ERP systems would be something to consider. College Intern did it using very cheap tools, so it's not a big cost. It's actually thinking about what a ledger would smell and look like.